So I mentioned a number of innovations that have evolved over the years with this very successful Food for Work program. You know, I've stressed in previous lectures as well that when I use the word we this and we that, I'm not just talking about any particular agency, but all of us involved using our comparative advantages, our complementary mandates, we hope. And this is a classic example of that approach, very specifically in Nepal. So I mentioned GTZ before, another ministry that was providing technical support as well to GTZ is BMZ, which is another ministry for development cooperation within the German government. DFID is the British version of USAID, if you will. The Danish Agency for International Development, the Swiss, again, these agencies are all very similar to the Brits, the Danes and the Swiss, and the Dutch, all their bilateral development agencies, again, very similar to USAID. UNDP is the UN Development Program, and one of our partners in capacity building in particular in the field. And then two other agencies focused on agriculture, IFAD and FAO. IFAD and FAO are both based in Rome and are sister cooperating agencies of ours working in agricultural development. And then NORAD is comparable again to DANIDA or SDC as the Norwegian agency, if you will, for international development. And then finally UNESCO is on the education side. They would help us with curriculum development and learning materials at schools that would be part of the backbone asset. I'm stressing this aspect of partnership because this is so incredibly important to the success of all of these types of interventions, that you have buy-in with the donors, not just that they give their resources and they sit around the executive board in the case of the World Food Program and yes or no, or yes, you should keep doing what you're doing, but they actually involve their own bilateral development agencies in the work on the ground and help us achieve those same results. These are shared objectives, shared visions, and it's one of the most effective aspects, I think, of international cooperation at the ground level. I mentioned the innovations of shifting from the more remote areas in the extreme northwest and the higher altitude areas. This is a picture of that I took actually looking south from the Tibet border at the Chinese border post, looking into Nepal, and these are the trails that we would have used to move with our, in this case, yak trains up into the populated area over the mountain pass. There's a mountain pass here, and we're very high up. We're about 5,000 meters here, which would be times 3. What is that? 15,000 feet. So it's fairly high, very remote, above the tree line. And this is a very good example of a backbone asset, this particular road. This road was one of the first ones built by the Food for Work program at the beginning as we started moving into this area. And you're thinking, again, that doesn't look like much of a road. Well, a vehicle would not be able to travel on it because there's no vehicles at this altitude. But this is simply an area, a road or a trail that animals, yaks in this case, and people can walk on. And it's built in what's called the green fashion of building roads, so that they're built a certain way and a certain angle to minimize water runoff, minimize erosion. And that's, again, where the engineers help us in terms of the road design. Then we have convoys through Tibet that I mentioned before. One area, we realized that these areas were extremely food insecure, but it would be generations before the roads could be built, before technically it would be even possible from an engineering point of view, and also before the resources would be even available to cut roads from the Terai, the lowland areas of Nepal in the far west, up to these high areas in Humla and Dolpa. These areas in the extreme northwest were more accessible through Tibet and China, as I explained in the earlier days. So the concept that we devised was that we realized that we needed to bring the food that we would use to pay the workers through China. And that involved trips to Beijing, trips to Lhasa to negotiate that access. of essentially running convoys, food convoys from Kathmandu north into China, into Tibet, and then across across the border areas in southern Tibet back into Nepal. That picture I showed you before was coming back in. And these were the trucks, Nepali trucks, UN flagged. And this was a 7-day, 1,300 kilometer, almost 2,000 mile trip from Kathmandu to Humla. This is yours truly standing there in the photo, discussing the route with our staff and the drivers. And once we got to the border area, and at that point there were no roads at all, we had to offload all the trucks, and the food was then loaded onto yaks. Yaks typically you only find over 2,000 feet. They don't thrive and even survive lower than that. But at this altitude, it's the main source of transportation for all the people living in these areas, whether on the Tibet side or on the Nepal side. And it's a very unique mode of transportation for us, but it worked well, and everything was loaded onto these yaks then and then transported for a few more days over the border back into Nepal. The food for portering I mentioned earlier as well. Food for portering is not just men, but women as well. This is a very key major area of employment for many people living in these more remote areas. It's seasonal employment, but if you think about it, literally everything has to be carried on people's backs. Clothes and food and building materials and roofing materials and seeds, everything, agricultural implements, tools, everything that they need to live with has literally got to be carried on their backs, given that there is no road penetration in these areas at all. And then we developed the idea of the food for portering as a way to support these porters in carrying the food for the Food for Work program. I mentioned the tools for community participation and transparency, the idea that they sit down every day at the end of the work shift to go over the amount of kilometers or the amount of dirt, the volume of dirt that they may have displaced for that time. But this is a photo of a user group of the beneficiary households where they sit down and then review their plans for the next week. They're paid with these vouchers, and then they go to our food store in the village and then exchange the voucher for the wage for the week or the month. I mean, it depends. It depends on the level of food insecurity in the area as to how often that they've received their wages. I stressed before the importance of transparency and having everything done openly. Again, you may think that I'm overemphasizing this point, but again, you have to remember that in many of these societies, people generally are not very well informed, not very well aware of how the power structures work. They often are at the receiving end of fairly subjective power, management power decisions, political decisions that could be to their detriment and often are. And that is one of the aspects of the leadership that I have been stressing in this course, that it's important for you to provide, for us to provide as foreigners, as development agencies working in these communities, to promote transparency, to make sure that everyone understands all payments, that the public audits are done openly, and that everyone understands who's receiving what.